Most people think they're ready to retire in Thailand until they actually live here, because there are two different versions of Thailand. There's the one you experience on holiday, easy, relaxed, almost effortless. And there's a version that you only start to notice after a few months of real life. And the gap between those two is where most people start to go wrong. Not with big dramatic problems, but with small things that slowly change how life feels. Moments where you stop and think, I didn't expect this. What's interesting is these things don't show up straight away. Some appear in the first few weeks, others take a few months, and one of them tends to show up much later, when everything else is already settled. None of these are reasons not to come. In fact, for the right person, Thailand can be one of the best places in the world to retire. But the people who enjoy it the most aren't the ones chasing the idea of it. They're the ones who understand what living here is actually like. And that's what this video is about. Not the fantasy, but the reality that sits just underneath it. Because once you see that clearly, everything becomes a lot easier. The first lesson people learn often begins with money, and not in a dramatic way. It's rarely one big mistake. It's a series of small, reasonable decisions that quietly change your monthly costs. It usually starts like this. You arrive in Thailand, everything feels affordable, and for the first few weeks it really is. Meals are cheap, transport feels inexpensive, and you start thinking, this is going to cost me far less than I expected. And then, without really noticing it, your lifestyle begins to shift. And this is where it gets interesting. You move from the occasional meal out to eating out most days, from a simple apartment to somewhere just a bit more comfortable. Maybe you add air conditioning during the day, not just at night. Maybe you start buying a few imported items that remind you of home. Individually, none of these feel expensive, but over a full month, they definitely add up. And then one month you look at the total spending and it's higher than you expected. Not by a little, but enough to make you pause. And this is where expectations and reality start to separate. Because yes, you can live in Thailand very cheaply, but most long-term retirees don't live like that. They build a life that feels comfortable, familiar, and easy. And that version of Thailand comes with a different price tag. Take housing, for example. You might find a basic local apartment for a few $100s, and it works. It's clean, functional, perfectly livable. But over time, many people realize they want a bit more. A proper kitchen, a comfortable living space, reliable air conditioning, a quieter environment. And suddenly that lower rent you planned for doubles or even triples. The same thing happens with food. Local meals are incredibly affordable and often excellent, but you won't eat that way every day. At some point you'll want variety, maybe a Western breakfast, imported groceries, or a familiar brand from home. And those items are rarely cheap. In fact, sometimes they cost more than they would do back home. Transport is another one that builds quietly over time. A lot of people imagine they'll use motorbikes like the locals, but in reality, that's not always comfortable or safe, especially as you get older. So instead, you'll rely on taxis, ride apps, or occasional private drivers. Each trip feels inexpensive, but over weeks and months, it becomes a real part of your budget. And then there are the costs people don't think about. Healthcare, visa renewals, flights back home, and electricity, especially during the hotter months when air conditioning runs almost constantly. That bill alone can surprise people the first time they see it. None of this means Thailand is expensive. It just means your lifestyle determines your cost, not the country itself. And this is where a lot of people get caught out. They plan their retirement around what's possible here, not how they'll actually choose to live. A much better approach is simple. Before committing long term, spend a few months living exactly how you would in retirement. Track everything, not just the big expenses, but the small, everyday ones. Because once you understand your real monthly costs, everything else becomes easier. You make decisions with confidence instead of guesswork, and you avoid that slow financial drift that catches so many people by surprise. And once you realize this, something else becomes very obvious. And this is where a lot of people make their next mistake. The next mistake doesn't come down to money, it comes down to where you choose to build your life. And this is where a lot of people get it wrong. Not because they didn't research, but because they based their decisions on the wrong experience. Usually it starts with a holiday. Maybe you spent a couple of weeks in a place like Phuket and everything about it felt perfect. The beaches, the restaurant, the energy, it feels like somewhere you could happily stay forever. And in that moment, the decision feels obvious. Why wouldn't I just live here? But living somewhere and visiting it are two very different experiences. What feels exciting for 2 weeks can feel very different after 2 months. In places like Phuket, you might start to notice things you didn't see as a visitor. The traffic during the high season, the higher cost of living, the small frustrations that only show up when you're dealing with everyday life, not just enjoying it. On the other hand, somewhere like Chiang Mai might seem like the perfect alternative. It's calmer, often cheaper, surrounded by mountains, but then certain times of year brings a completely different reality, like the smoky season, when the air quality becomes a real concern for many people. And then there are smaller coastal towns like Hua Hin or Rayong, quieter, slower, more balanced. For some people, they're exactly what retirement should feel like. But for others, they can feel a little too quiet, especially if you're used to having more options, more variety, or easier access to major hospitals and services. And this is the key point. There is no perfect place in Thailand, only the place that fits your lifestyle. And that's something you can't fully understand from a short visit. The biggest mistake people make is committing too early, signing a long lease, or even buying property before they've truly experienced day-to-day life in that area. A much better approach is to treat your first year as a kind of experiment. Spend a few months in one place, then move. Try a different region, a different pace, a different environment. And don't judge your place on your best days. Pay attention to the ordinary days. A random Tuesday morning, a trip to the supermarket, how easy it is to get to a hospital or a pharmacy, how the area feels when you're not doing anything at all. Because that's what your life will mostly be made up of. It's also worth paying attention to the people around you. Some areas have strong expat communities. They're social, active, and easy to connect with. Others are quieter, more local, and can feel isolating if you're not prepared for that. Neither is right or wrong. It just depends on what kind of life you want to build. And once you find that place that feels right, not exciting but comfortable, everything starts to fall into place. Your routines feel easier, your days feel smoother, and life becomes less about adjusting and more about enjoying where you are. But even when you find the right place, there's something else most people haven't fully thought through yet. The next thing people underestimate isn't lifestyle, it's healthcare. And this one tends to stay in the background right up until the moment you actually need it. Because when you first think about retiring in Thailand, healthcare often feels like a positive. Private hospitals are modern, efficient, and in many cases excellent. In fact, places like Bangkok Hospital or Bumrungrad International Hospital are known for high standards, experienced doctors, and relatively short waiting times. And compared to Western countries, the cost of routine care can feel very reasonable. So it's easy to assume this part will take care of itself. But the reality is a little more complicated than that, because there's a difference between accessible healthcare and fully planned healthcare. A standard consultation might be affordable, but more serious treatment, a hospital stay, surgery, or ongoing care can become expensive very quickly. And in Thailand, those costs are usually expected up front. There's no system quietly covering things in the background. And this is where people can feel exposed, especially if they haven't planned ahead. Insurance is one option, but timing matters more than people realize. The earlier you arrange it, the more options you have. Because as you get older, policies become more expensive, more restrictive, or sometimes unavailable altogether. Pre-existing conditions can be excluded, coverage can be limited, and waiting until you need it is usually too late. So the best time to think about healthcare planning is before you ever need to use it. Some people choose full insurance coverage. Others take a more balanced approach, combining a smaller policy for major health events with personal savings set aside for everyday care. There's no single right answer, but having a plan makes all the difference. It's also worth understanding how healthcare works locally. Smaller clinics are everywhere and often very good for day-to-day issues. They're affordable, convenient, and part of everyday life here, which means you don't always need to rely on large private hospitals. And that balance between local care and major medical support is what helps many long-term residents manage both costs and peace of mind. Because ultimately, this isn't just about money, it's about confidence, knowing that if something unexpected happens, you won't be making decisions under pressure. You'll already have a system in place, and that changes how you experience life here. You relax more, you worry less, you settle in properly. Because you're not just enjoying Thailand, you're prepared to live here. And once you reach that point, you start to notice something else shift. Not in your health, but in your expectations of daily life. If you're still watching at this point, you're already ahead of the most people planning to move here, because this is the part most people don't think about until it's too late. There's another moment that catches almost everyone off guard, and it doesn't happen straight away. It usually shows up a few months in once the novelty begins to wear off. Because when you first arrive in Thailand, life can feel almost effortless. You wake up to sunshine, you explore new places, you try different food every day. There's no routine, no pressure, no real sense of time. And for a while, it feels like you've stepped into something permanent. Like this is just life now. But then, slowly, some things change. Not in a negative way, just in a real one. Because living in Thailand still means living. You start having ordinary days, quiet mornings where nothing much happens, errands that need doing, small routines that begin to repeat themselves. And for some people, this is where the adjustment begins. Not because Thailand has changed, but because your role in it has. You're no longer experiencing it as a visitor, you're living inside it. And that's a very different feeling. Some retirees struggle with this more than they expect. They built their idea of Thailand around a permanent sense of ease, where every day feels like a light version of a holiday. So when normal life appears, the slower days, the quieter routines, it can feel like something has been lost. But in reality, nothing has been lost. You've just moved past the surface. Because this is where a different kind of life begins. One that's less about constant stimulation and more about steady contentment. You start to notice small things. A regular morning walk that becomes part of the rhythm. Familiar faces at the same cafes. Afternoons that feel slower but more peaceful. And over time, these moments start to matter more than the excitement ever did. That's when Thailand shifts from somewhere you visit to somewhere you actually belong. It helps to accept this transition early, to build small routines, to allow for quieter days, not to chase the feeling of a holiday, but to settle into something more sustainable. Because the goal isn't to feel excited every day, it's to feel comfortable. And when you reach that point, when life feels simple, steady, and your own, that's when retirement here really begins to work. But for many people, just as you start to settle into that rhythm, another reality begins to surface. And this one isn't about lifestyle at all. It's about distance and the people you left behind. There's one part of retiring abroad that doesn't get talked about enough, and it has nothing to do with money, location, or lifestyle. It's distance. Not just physical distance, but emotional distance. Because when you picture moving to Thailand, this is rarely part of the image. You're thinking about the weather, the cost of living, the freedom, not what it feels like to be far away from the people you've known for most of your life. And in the beginning, it doesn't feel like a problem. You're settling in, exploring, building a new routine. You call home regularly, maybe you plan a trip back within the first year. Everything feels manageable. But distance has a way of revealing itself slowly. It's not one big moment, it's small things. Missing a birthday, not being there for a family event, hearing about something important after it's already happened. And over time, them moments can start to add up. For some people, it's not overwhelming, just a quiet awareness in the background. For others, it can feel stronger than you expected, especially as the years pass. Travel becomes more tiring, long flights feel longer, and going back and forth isn't always as easy as it once was. Meanwhile, life continues back home. Families grow older, friends move on, things change, with or without you there. And that can feel like a bigger distance than the miles themselves. This is something many retirees don't fully anticipate because it doesn't show up in the first few months. It shows up later when life here has already become normal and life back home has continued without you. But this doesn't mean something has gone wrong. It just means this part of the experience needs attention. And the people who handle it well tend to do one thing differently. They build connections where they are, not just casually, but intentionally. That might mean getting to know people locally, spending time in the same place regularly, joining small communities, groups, or activities, and not only with other foreigners. Some of the strongest connections come from engaging with local people, even in simple, everyday ways. Over time, those small interactions start to build familiarity, and familiarity turns into something more meaningful. At the same time, staying connected to home matters too, not occasionally but regularly. Simple routines help. Weekly calls, shared photos, planned visits rather than last minute ones. Having something in your calendar makes the distance feel more manageable because it turns something uncertain into something you can look forward to. And gradually something shifts. The distance doesn't disappear, but it softens because now you're not just someone living far away, you're someone who has a life in two places. And that balance between connection and independence is what allows many people to truly settle into life here. But even when you find that balance, there's one more mistake that can quietly shape your experience. And it often comes from trying to make things feel too permanent too quickly. After a few months of feeling settled, it's very natural to want to make things permanent. You found a place you like, you recognize the streets, maybe you've even met a few people who make it feel familiar. And at some point, a thought appears, why not just settle here properly? It sounds sensible. After years of working, moving, planning, finally choosing one place and calling it home feels like the right step. But in Thailand, this is where a lot of people move too quickly. Not because they're making a bad decision, but because they're making it too early. Because the truth is, your experience of a place can change over time. What feels perfect in the beginning might feel different 6 months later. Not worse, just different. Maybe the area feels quieter than you expected. Maybe it's further from good healthcare than you realized. Maybe the pace that felt relaxing at first starts to feel a little too slow. And once you've committed, especially financially, those small shifts become harder to adjust to. This is especially important when it comes to property, because unlike some countries, owning property in Thailand as a foreigner comes with certain limitations. You generally can't own land in your own name. Condominiums are an option, but even then, there are ownership rules, quotas, and long-term considerations. And beyond the legal side, there's the lifestyle side. Buying a place can anchor you, not just financially, but mentally. It makes moving feel like a bigger decision than it needs to be. That's why many long-term residents choose to rent, at least in the beginning. Renting gives you flexibility. It allows you to adjust if your preferences change, or if you simply discover a place that suits you better over time. It also gives you the chance to experience different parts of Thailand more fully, spending time in the north, then by the coast, then somewhere quieter, until you find the environment that truly fits your day-to-day life. Because that's what matters most. Not how a place looks on your best day, but how it feels on an ordinary one. A random weekday afternoon, a quiet evening, a routine morning. And the more time you give yourself to understand that, the better your long-term decision will be. There's no advantage to rushing this part. In fact, patience usually leads to better outcomes, better locations, better value, and far less stress. Think of your first year not as settling down, but as learning, exploring without pressure, adjusting without commitment. Because once you truly understand what works for you, the decision to stay somewhere becomes easy, not forced. And that's when you know you've found the right place. But even with the right location and the right lifestyle, there's still one final piece that can quietly cause problems if it's overlooked. And it's not about where you live, but how you manage the practical side of staying long term. The final mistake isn't emotional, and it isn't obvious at first either. It's practical. The day to day systems that allow you to stay in Thailand long term. Because when people imagine retiring here, they picture the lifestyle, not the structure behind it. But over time, it's that structure that determines how smooth your life actually feels. Things like visas. Most long term retirees rely on retirement visa, which usually involves meeting certain financial requirements. That might mean showing a monthly income or maintaining a set amount in a Thai bank account. And then there are the routines that come with it: 90-day address reporting, annual renewals, occasional rule changes that require attention. None of it is especially difficult, but it does require consistency. And for people who arrive without understanding this side of things, it can feel more complicated than expected. The same applies to money: how you move your money between countries, how exchange rates affect your monthly income, how you access it locally. These aren't things you think about on holiday, but they matter a lot when you're living here full time. There are also smaller practical details that make a difference over time: setting up local banking, understanding how bills are paid, keeping copies of important documents. It's not complicated, but it does require a bit of organization. And this is where many people either feel settled or unsettled, not because their lifestyle is wrong, but because the background systems aren't clear. The good news is, once you've set these things up properly, they become routine. You stop thinking about them, and that's the goal. Some people choose to handle everything themselves. Others use visa agents or professional services to simplify the process and avoid mistakes. Both approaches work. What matters is having a system you understand. Because once the practical side of life is taken care of, everything else opens up. You're not worried about deadlines. You're not second guessing paperwork. You're just living your life. And that's when Thailand starts to feel easy again. Not because it's simple on the surface, but because you've built a structure underneath it. When you look at all these together, it's easy to see why some people struggle after moving to Thailand. Not because they made a bad decision, but because they came in with the wrong expectations. They expected it to feel easy straight away. They expected it to feel like a permanent holiday. They expected things to just fall into place over time. And when that doesn't happen, it can feel disappointing. But the reality is, none of those things are deal breakers. They're just adjustments. And once you understand them, everything changes. Because Thailand can be an incredible place to live. The lifestyle can be calmer, the cost of living can be more manageable, the pace of life can feel exactly right. But it works best for people who approach it properly. People who take their time choosing where to live, people who plan for healthcare and long-term costs, people who understand that there will be an adjustment period and allow them to go through it. Because when you do that, the experience becomes very different. It becomes more stable, more predictable, more comfortable, and most importantly, more sustainable long term. That's the difference between people who enjoy a few months here and people who build a life here. If you can get these things right before you move, you put yourself in a completely different position. You're not reacting, you're prepared, and that changes everything. Now, one of the biggest factors that influences all of this is where you choose to live. Because different areas in Thailand offer completely different lifestyles, different costs, different pace, different day-to-day experiences. And this is where a lot of people either get it right or they get it very wrong. So in some of the next videos, I'll be breaking down some of the best places to live in Thailand as a retiree, depending on the kind of lifestyle that you actually want, because choosing the right location can make the entire transition feel easier. If you've enjoyed today's video, can you just do me a massive favor and press the subscribe button? It really helps the channel, helps push videos like this to other people who want to retire in Thailand. Thanks for watching today, and I'll see you on the next one.